The topic for today's discussion is the privatization of national assets. The assets which have been created by the hard work of working class, as well as peasants and other people, and using the national natural assets. And now these assets are being privatized. So I have got two guests today on this panel. First is Shivanand Kanvi, who's a physicist, a senior journalist, author, and he's also vice president of Lograj Sangathan and founding member of Lograj. So welcome Shivanand Kanvi to today's discussion. And
thanks for having me on this panel.
Okay. Our second panelist is Salvinder Tillon, who's trained as a electronic engineering. Okay, who's trained as a electronic engineer, and he also had various experiences, and he was lecturer at the university in physics and history, and presently he's teaching in a school the subject of history. So, and he's connected with Gather International. So welcome Salvinder Tillon as well.
Thank you, Devinder, and thanks to the Indian Work Association to have us on this panel.
Okay. So my first question is for Shivanand. Shivanand, when India got independence, the bourgeoisie, Indian bourgeoisie, whose representative at the time was the Congress Party and Nehru especially, and he said they will be building a socialistic pattern of society in India, because Indian people had sentiments towards socialism at that time, because after Second World War, all the newly independent countries wanted socialism in their countries, and so they used this this slogan of creating a socialistic pattern of society in India. And all the major sectors of economy like steel, railways, aviation, health, defense and armament industry, post and telegraphs, all these were under the state control at that time. And slowly they started privatizing all this to benefit the bourgeoisie of India. And what are your views on this, Shivanand?
Yeah, let me go a little back from even independence to see how this bourgeoisie manipulated the struggle against the British in their own interests. So first of all, the rise of there have been entrepreneurs in India even in the pre-colonial days and during the colonial days. And there was no lack of capital either within India. There were quite a few rich people, both among the Maharajas and among traders, moneylenders, etc.
Yeah.
And in fact, now it's well known that many times East India Company borrowed from these large Seths in India for its own operations. So they were large enough and they had massive trade networks starting from Egypt to Malaya, and they had their own banking system, etc., etc. This is even in the pre-colonial days. Now, but what happened is that once the British colonialism established itself and took control, they started suppressing any entrepreneurial activity from Indians. So there were many attempts by Indians to set up steel industry, jute industry, textiles, shipbuilding, shipping, even plantations, tea plantations, etc. But all these attempts were suppressed by the British. So whatever little business could come up, it was purely when the British government allowed it to come up, you know. So there was tremendous resentment about this within the entrepreneurial class in India. So it was not only that the vast sections of peasantry and intellectuals and traders and others were suppressed by the British, but even the entrepreneurial class was suppressed. So the entrepreneurial class, the business class, the bourgeoisie, they whatever opportunity they got, they tried to come up within that and compete. And eventually, by 1940s, they had overtaken the British capital within India. So they had come to control insurance, banking, manufacturing, and everything. And in fact, imports from Britain had almost come to nil by 1940-41. So basically, the rise started from the First World War. They used the war situation and they set up various industries because they said, okay, we don't have the technology, but we can buy the technology. We can buy machinery. We have enough capital and we'll set up our own industries. So that is how textile and jute industry came up. Though British tried various ways to suppress it, but very soon Indian textile and jute industry became quite strong. Indian owned textile and jute industry became very strong. The imports were cut down. And also after First World War, Britain became a debtor state. Actually, it became a debtor state and the economy was very weak. So Britain was doing everything possible to hold on to its colonies, particularly India, and extract as much as possible from it through various means. And one of the means, of course, was controlling the exchange rate between sterling and rupee. Now, rupee was a very strong currency, and rupee was an international currency. In fact, Indian rupee was a valid currency in vast sections of Asia, in the Indian Ocean trade, all the way from Malaya, Indonesia to Aden, Yemen and all that. So that is why even today, many countries in this belt have some version of rupiah or rupee as their currency, even their new national currencies. So the British were fixing the exchange rate arbitrarily, which to the detriment of Indian people, to extract as much as possible from India after the World War. So an agitation started, led by the Tatas and Birlas, that this should not happen. That monetary policy should be rational and it should be controlled from Delhi and not from London. And they wanted a central bank to be established to determine these exchange rates and all these policies. So it is actually Tatas and Birlas who actually led all the businessmen and chambers of commerce. They set up a vast network of that all over India. And by 26, 27, there was a strong agitation among them that there should be a Reserve Bank of India set up under, and which will determine the policy. So finally, the British gave in. And in fact, even when there was this roundtable conferences, it is recorded that major Indian capitalists used those conferences to put all these points on the agenda. And in fact, it has been recorded that J.D. Birla went as part of delegation and tutored Mahatma Gandhi on what to say there on monetary policy. And in fact, he stayed in the same hotel. He spent a whole night tutoring Mahatma Gandhi next day what to say in the conference. That how this monetary policy should be fixed by India and Indian capitalists and all that. Okay, but the British, of course, rejected it. British didn't agree to that and tried their best to split the Indian delegations on caste, communal lines, and so on and so forth. Okay. Now, but this resentment continued, and finally the British gave in to it, and in 1934-35, Reserve Bank of India was established. But at the same time, the monetary policy still was controlled by London. But Tatas and Birlas came onto the on the governing board of Reserve Bank of India right from 1934-35, from the establishment days. And finally, so there was an intense competition, and you can say contention, as well as they were trying to make use of the best situation, whatever was available in the Second World War, whatever opportunities were available. And continuously they were asking Britain to shift defense production and various high-tech industries to India. Like Britain transferred some of those industries to New Zealand and Australia and Canada during that period. So Indian capitalists were also demanding that similarly such high-tech industries should also be transferred to India, and we can make planes and tanks and so on and so forth. But the British did not do that. While they did transfer some to Canada and Australia, they did not transfer that. They did not want some strategic industries to go to India, to Indian capitalists. But still, Indian capitalists, with whatever avenues were available, grew stronger during the World War II and kept negotiating that right after the war, you should give us the independence. And when British did not openly accept that, then they even encouraged the Congress Party to go on this Quit India movement and all that, and funded the Quit India movement. Even gave shelter to many of the people, who went underground during that time, and so on and so forth. So, in fact, Quit India movement represented the unhappiness of the Indian capitalists towards this British rule, because British were not agreeing to give it independence or promise independence even verbally. Churchill was very much against that. So in any case, right then they started making plans on what should be the shape of Indian economy. So they set up a planning committee in the Congress Party in 1938. Eventually Nehru was made head of that committee, and it started discussing with all the capitalists and the chambers and what should be the shape of the Indian economy. But it was taking its own time to come out with its report. And also the Congress leadership was involved in the political struggle. So what the capitalists decided is that let us come out with our own plan. We need not wait for this Congress committee to come out. So JRD Tata, GD Birla, and 6-7 other capitalists and executives, including Lala Shri Ram, Purushottam Das Thakur Das, and Kasturbai Lalbai, and 2-3 others. They 7-8 of them came together, Ardeshe Dalal and so on, came together, and in 1944 started working on a plan, and within a year came out of it. So that plan was, part 1 was released in 1944 December, and part 2 was released in January. And that is a remarkable plan, and
which is called Tata Birla Plan, yeah?
Yes. Formally it was called the Bombay Plan, because it was produced from Bombay. But popularly it was called Tata Birla Plan because these two were signatories to that. Yes. And it was not some secret plan. It was published and it was sold for 1 rupee or something like that. So the copies of that are available in the libraries, and even on digital libraries you can download it from the internet. And that is a remarkable plan. And there they set out their vision.
So they were quite confident at the time that they will get independence.
Absolutely. I mean, because it was a foregone conclusion that already by 1940-41, they were in control of the economy. And it was just political transfer of power that was needed. And so they will, on the one hand, they will say we are loyal servants of British rule. On the other hand, they will encourage agitation against it. For example, while they were saying we are supporting the war effort and profiting from it, they were also funding the Quit India movement. So, so the double game they kept playing with the British, and they effectively used Congress leadership and Congress forum and whatever influence Congress had in the mass organizations among people to put pressure on the British to transfer power. So they were clearly interested, they were very much interested in retaining that colonial state, that centralized state which had come into being and all its institutions, but they wanted the power to be transferred to them.
Right.
They did not want to destroy the colonial state. They very much were interested in retaining that colonial state.
So they wanted to be the new rulers.
Yes, yes. They wanted control from Delhi in their hands instead of control in London. So that was the change they wanted, and not any major change in the state, in the character of the state. The important thing is, in that plan, they chalked out how the revival of India, industrial revival of India, should take place. And other thing they did was in 1944-45, personally, G.D. Birla and J.R.D. Tata went to London and Washington to negotiate with British capitalists and US capitalists to bring in high-tech industries to India, aerospace, automobile, and so on. But the British and Americans refused to do that. They said, we will sell these goods to you, or if at all we set up a factory there, it will be 100% controlled by us, or at least majority controlled by us. Both Tatas and Birlas were against that. They said, you cannot control it. We will give you minority stake, or you sell the technology to us. So British and Americans refused to do that. And that is interesting. That is when these people refused to accept British and American capital by their terms. And they said, it's all right, we'll use second-rate technology, it's all right, we'll run with old cars, old trucks, we need not get your new things, but we'll not give you control. And it is just after that, when they found that Khrushchev's Russia was ready to give them various technologies, they were very happy, and quickly they accepted that. Because Washington and
Not to
London...
lose India to socialist circles. So they didn't want India to join the socialist circle in the world, yeah?
No, not at all. It is basically they needed the technology from Russia, and they agreed. And in fact, for 1948, Parliament passed this industrial policy, which was totally based on the Tata Birla plan. And then when they wanted, Soviet Union came out with an offer of technologies in various industries later in the 50s, they quickly sort of recast that same old plan and just called it socialist in 1956.
Right.
And also the Congress party declared that now we'll have a socialist pattern of society, etc., etc. So it was quite a clever thing. But basically, the agenda was set by the big capitalists. You know,
the clever design.
Yeah, and the so-called tilt to Soviet Union was clearly pragmatic basis, because Soviet Union was ready to give them technology which British and Americans were not ready to give.
And they gave as well.
So at that time, they put forward this view that we have to build our own basic industry, since anyway foreigners are not giving us technology. So in that in the 1944-45 plan itself, it's very interesting how they put forward the importance of the public sector. So I'll just read a small, summary of that, what the plan actually proposed. And it's very, very revealing. It says, and at that time, by the way, Indian capitalists were extremely active. They went to Bretton Woods conference also. Where IMF and World Bank were founded, and they even they were arguing there more vigorously than they were part of the British delegate. Spell out what this plan said about state control and state role because part 2 of the plan was purely about role of the state.
Mm.
And it says controls will be exercised, operated mainly by the state in production, distribution, consumption, investment, foreign trade and exchange, and wages and working conditions. Bombay plan said this. Okay, state will exercise control. Then it also said that there will be a system of licenses. Control will operate chiefly through a system of licenses for establishing new units. Distribution will be controlled primarily by determining priorities. Rationing and distribution of consumer goods it also said capital market will also be regulated and controlled by the state, and it will promote the interests of Indian nationals, and trade and exchange will also be controlled by the state for conserving foreign exchange and for protection of Indian industry.
Right.
And interestingly, there is also a clause there. It says, if later on if later on private finance is prepared to take over these industries, state ownership may be replaced by private ownership.
So
that was the plan right from the beginning.
Right from the beginning. Right from the beginning. So build these assets.
Yeah.
By taxpayers' money, these national assets, and protect the Indian capital from competition from abroad, both foreign capital and foreign goods, protection from both into the market, so that they have a protected market. You allow them to grow, you give them a large, continental size market to them, to Indian industry, block foreigners, and when they are big enough and they have become more ambitious and strong enough, then you can think of handing over these same national assets to them.
So Shinanji, so this was actually like a platform from which they can go towards private ownership. So they build a basic needed infrastructure for the private sector under the socialist guise.
Absolutely. And I just want to, since there's not much time, we'll discuss the things later about this. But modern day economists and state or politicians, how do they look at this plan? Not much was heard about this after 1944, because basically it became state's plan. But in 2004, Dr. Manmohan Singh, on the centenary of J.R.D. Tata, he gave a talk in which he talked about this plan at length. And I'm just quoting from him. He said, Dr. Manmohan Singh has acted as economic advisor, planning commission deputy chairman, special economic advisor, finance minister, prime minister, and so on and so forth. So for more than 50 years, he has served the Indian state. So we can take his opinion as a testimony of what Indian state and politicians think about this plan. He's well qualified to represent that. So he said, as a student of economics in the 1950s and later as a practitioner in government, I was greatly impressed by the Bombay Plan of 1944. When we read it today, nearly 60 years later, this is from a talk he gave in 2004. So it was 60 years after that. Now it is 75 years since that plan came into being. So he says, when we read it today, nearly 60 years later, we see how relevant many of the central propositions of the Bombay Plan remain. In those days, he said, in those days, it was an unprecedented document. It is worthy of emphasis that nowhere in the developing world had a group of businessmen come together to draw up such a long-term plan for a country. He also said, Bombay Plan laid great emphasis on public investment in social and economic infrastructure in both rural and urban areas. It emphasized the importance of agrarian reform and agricultural research in setting up educational institutions, which later became IITs, IIMs, and so on and so forth. and modern financial system, stock exchanges, all these other things. And above all, it defined the framework of India's transition from agrarian feudalism to industrial capitalism. This is what Dr. Manmohan Singh says. And then he says, and then he ends it saying, in many ways, it encapsulated what all subsequent 5-year plans have tried to achieve. That is quite something. It's quite an open admission that basically Indian economy was charted out by these big capitalists in a very far-sighted manner in their interest. And what they had learned was to project their interest as national interest.
Yes.
So they did that everywhere. In fact, in 1944-45, also negotiations started in Washington for a new international trading system, which later became GATT and WTO, etc. At that time also, Indian capitalists put forward the thesis about how we are a poor country, we are a developing country, and what we should do, and how international trade should favor these developing countries, etc., and act as a spokesman of that. And they pushed in the founding conference of World Bank that World Bank should have poverty alleviation as one of its aims. Okay, and they so even today, when representatives of Indian government go to WTO and in various conferences of WTO, they basically use the same arguments to get certain concessions and so on. So you can say doesn't matter what the signboard is. It can be socialism.
Yes.
It can be Gandhian socialism, Nehruvian socialism. Today, Mr. Modi might call it some other socialism, whatever, sabka vikas, sabka, vishwas, whatever. But so the basic blueprint of that has been put forward by the big bourgeoisie, and as time evolves, they have been making various adjustments to it.
Shivananda, just one.
I would say that so this privatization, which they had foreseen in 44, it is that which they started implementing 50 years later in the 1990s, once the conditions were ripe, and they also had become strong enough to start going global. And then they had to open up, because they cannot tell Britain that we will come and buy British steel industry or British automotive industry if they do not allow British capital to come into India.
So Shivanand, so they had two parts in that, it seems. One was to get rid of remnants of feudalism and pave the way for capitalism in their own interest, and build the infrastructure necessary to do that. Would that?
So that means Indian bourgeoisie now feels quite